Welcome everyone to CAMOC's webinar on social housing in the city. Today, my name is Glenn Perkins, and on behalf of the Greensboro History Museum that is hosting the webinar Zoom side of this, and CAMOC, the International Committee, the International Council of Museums Committee dedicated to city museums and the activities of city museums and the people and the lives of the cities whose stories that we work with to tell. I want to welcome you to this program. Our committee deals with a lot of important sort of topical issues around life in the cities. And so our board member, Andrea de la Place, who's also editor of our fantastic publication, the CAMOC Review, has pulled together this amazing panel of discussants to build on a workshop that she did at our last conference in New York City last fall, the CAMOC conference. For those of you who are interested, our next conference is coming up in October in Amsterdam in collaboration with another international committee, the COMCOL, the International Committee on Collecting, and our partners at the Amsterdam Museum and Imagine IC. I will put information about that meeting into the chat for anybody who does not know about it. There's still time to register and join us, and there will be online options for you to connect with if you're not able to come to Amsterdam. So without any more further ado, Andrea, I give the floor to you to get us started.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you very much. So thank you everyone that joined us today. And thank you all the speakers for accepting the invitation to participate to this roundtable. The main goal of the discussion is also to give a little preview of what you can read and you can find in the CAMOC review. So Glenn will be sharing on the chat the link to our website where you can download the full publication. One of the main articles of this latest edition is dedicated to the Bon Pastor project in Barcelona that is part of MUBA, the Museum of the City of Barcelona. That's why we have Paulo and Elena that are representing MUBA and the Bon Pastor project, and they'll be talking a little bit more about it. And if you want to read the full article, so you can check it on the latest issue. As Glenn said, this roundtable is also connected to the first roundtable that took place last year in New York City during our annual conference. And another topic that it's also present in the CAMOC review is collecting the city. So this issue, we have these both thematics that are connected to CAMOC activities and conferences. So if you're interested about collecting the city, housing and museums, or any other topics that are connected to city museums, please do check our website. So let's say the advertisement of CAMOC done. Let's dive into the roundtable. So again, thank you all the speakers for accepting to participate today. I'm not going to be talking any longer. We're going to jump straight ahead to the discussions. So each speaker will present quickly their project or their museum in 5 minutes. And then we have a series of questions. If you do have any questions during the discussions, please put the question on the little chat box, and Glenn and I will take care of that, and we will ask your question at the end of the main discussion. So thank you everyone, and let's start. So Lisa, I hand over to you.
Hi, thank you so much. And I'm so happy to be here with everybody. Thanks for being here. So my name is Lisa, and I'm a cultural activist and the executive director of the National Public Housing Museum, a civic institution envisioned and founded by public housing residents in the wake of the Plan for Transformation, which was an urban renewal plan that actually demolished most of the high-rise public housing in Chicago, that represented the largest net loss of affordable housing in the history of the United States. So this is the contradiction that led to our founding in the last remaining building of the Jane Addams homes. Our mission is to preserve, promote, and propel the right of all people to a place where everyone can live and prosper and work, for housing as a human right. So the museum calls on the power of place and memory and explores what we have not yet learned from the history of housing in order to address current issues and to unleash the visitors' imaginations about creating a more collective and just future for all of us. Storytelling and challenging mainstream narratives is the core of our work and our theory of change. We know the dangers of a single story, and our work seeks to amplify the voices of public housing residents to make sure that never again will a single story be told as if it was the only one. But we also really honor and respect the notion that Rebecca Solnit has said, which is, it's always someone else's story first, and it never stops being their story too, no matter how well you tell it and how widely you spread it. This is a core belief of ours and informs how we began our work and how we continue to do our efforts, which is through the gathering of stories of public housing residents through oral history methodology. And we now have the largest archive of public housing stories in the United States. We also offer oral history training sessions for public housing residents, which includes ethics, media, and technology training. And our program is called the Beauty Turner Oral History Academy. And Beauty was a resident of Robert Taylor Homes. And just like the great Dr. Tim Black or Studs Terkel, she used to run oral history tours of the city of Chicago, taking people to public housing projects. And she called these tours the ghetto bus tours. And for her, the word ghetto stood for the greatest history ever told to our people. The P is silent, but the people are not. You can now also access our stories on our new website, which is mphm.org, where you can hear stories and sort of encounter people. And it's really, really, that's the work that sort of has informed all of our exhibitions, which will open soon. From these stories, we've created, for example, 3 restored apartments, just like our sister museum, the Tenement Museum in New York, that tells the diverse histories of public housing through the lens of different generations of residents. The first apartment is where Molly Turovitz lived and includes a restored kosher kitchen. The second delves into the history of housing injustice, which led to current conditions. And the third is based on the oral history of the Hatch family, an African-American family who lived in the Jane Addams homes during the same period as Dr. Martin Luther King's Freedom Summer and his work for open housing. And what we've learned is when we listen, truly listen to the individual stories of public housing residents, we can challenge the racial stereotypes about people. Many of those stereotypes sort of frame public housing residents as people living large and benefiting from government handouts. But this has really eclipsed the reality of actual families and communities deeply in need of support, living in poverty due to misfortune, the injustices of capitalism, and the long-term effects of racism in the United States and the legacy of slavery. And we instead, try to hear the stories of collective joy, of diverse individuals and vibrant communities that formed imaginative and complex networks of support and long-lasting friendships while facing many struggles. And when you listen to the stories of public housing residents, you start to understand the difference between the resilience and resistance of the people of public housing from the systems of injustice that informed the failed policies. You also start to understand that housing is not really about housing at all. It's really stories about public health, public safety, and policing, the history of surveillance. It's about public education and the dismantling of and closing of under-resourced schools, et cetera. And for this reason, and finally, I just want to share, our museum has a very diverse program of exhibits and programs. When we heard the stories of candy ladies and barbershops, we started sort of an informal economy working group that studied this history and also led to the creation of our museum store cooperative, which is owned with public housing residents. When we listen to the stories of musicians who lived in public housing, whether it's Curtis Mayfield from Cabrini Green or Barbara Streisand, we started a rec room that is curated with DJ Spinderella that really tries to explore the soundtrack of American life, which can't be told without the history of public housing. We also collect objects from different communities with the focus this first year on New York, Houston, and Chicago. So we have objects from Sonia Sotomayor and George Floyd. And the next year we'll focus on Osage Nation, St. Louis, and Los Angeles. We believe that cultural change always precedes political change. And there's this beautiful quote from the hip hop scholar Jeff Chang, which says, every moment of major social change requires a collective leap of imagination. Political transformation must be accompanied not just by spontaneous and organized expressions of unrest and risk, but also an explosion of mass creativity. And so in our museum, we link arts, culture with public policy transformation. And there's a whole series of public art exhibitions from Indigenous artists to African American artists that are both temporary and permanent installations throughout this space. And so I'll just close by saying the great poet and philosopher Toni Cade Bambara has said that the role of the cultural worker is to make the revolution irresistible. And that's what we try to do at the National Public Housing Museum. And for housing, I think a critical part of that revolution is to decommodify housing so that it can truly become a human right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you for this very interesting introduction. Now let's go ahead with Jane. Please, Jane, it's your turn.
Hello, everybody. Lovely to be here. Just going to share a presentation with you. Okay, so I'm Jane Murray. I'm an artist and a housing activist. I lead a socially engaged arts project in Druids Heath, which is an estate on the southern edge of Birmingham in the UK. It was originally built as council housing, so by the local authority and owned by the local authority. It officially opened in 1965. We currently, so like the Arts Project has a partnership with a museum that's part of the National Trust in England called the Back to Backs in Birmingham city centre. So that's a museum that houses, I think it's 5 back-to-back houses, which are a particular kind of house that were condemned in the late 60s as uninhabitable. So the Druids Heath estate is subject to redevelopment, and this is only 59 years after being built. So people in the tower blocks are being cleared out and people's homes compulsory purchased. So they're not all council homes anymore. And currently it's looking a lot like gentrification. So I've been working with residents in the tower blocks to record their experiences of this clearance process and to get their views on the regeneration. So I'm going to show you some examples of the work that represents their experiences. The process that we use is to record stories. So we will start with an initial interview, and we may revisit several times over the year that it takes for them to empty a tower block. And really it's about generating a dialogue that makes evident the impact of this process on people and what is most important to them, what resonates most, and also there will be common experiences, and there's a kind of duty to you know, pick up and share those as well. So what we have here, a couple of the posters that have been made, and we deliberately decided to make things that are easily accessible and shared. So the posters can go anywhere, they can be pasted, they can be framed, they're very cheap to make. The one on the left is about coming from a slum and ending up in a slum in this very, very short space of time. And there's an awareness that I have from other research that areas that are built for slum clearance do tend to become slums again, because they're built meanly, basically, and people are judged because they're they're coming from a slum. The one on the right is about the limbo experience by people, which is we're just waiting. People find themselves in these situations where, because they don't know where they're going to live, they can't possibly make any life decisions. We Are People, Not Cattle is all about how people are not treated in a humane manner, really. They're more treated as numbers, and they're treated as stock to be shifted. They're not valued, and it's not sensitive. So there's a massive impact on people in terms of their mental health, really. That's what's emerged from this process. We have Nights Living Alone, which is a piece about a man who was left to live alone in a tower block for over a year. You know, there's a lot of toing and froing when we make these pieces. So the suggestions, going away, trial, error to come up with the end pieces. This was a comment on the left. There will always be sacrifices by the project manager. And an observation that it's being torn apart. So what's happening on this estate is all those things that make it a good place to live are being devalued, and it is, you know, just being ripped apart, really. All the networks that are there that make a community, you know, it's like the blood and flesh, not the bricks and mortar that makes a community. And I think that's something that people in planning and regeneration fail to recognise. So that was a very brief tour of some of the work. We've got other things such as badges, pillowcases, a doormat and a blue plaque, which is something we have a lot of in England to celebrate people. We were looking to share this body of work that had been made and beyond the estate, and give residents a much, much bigger platform. And we were aware of the back-to-backs in the city centre. And we were aware that the Drewbury Heath estate was built when they demolished these condemned properties of like old Victorian terraced housing. They built the big new estates for people to move into. So there's many parallels with the experience as well. People were cleared from the back-to-backs. They're being cleared from Druids Heath. They were overcrowded. In the back-to-backs, they're very overcrowded now. They lived in poverty, the same now. Poor housing conditions from cheaply, badly built houses, cold, damp. But also the very, very strong sense of community, and it's your home. And people don't necessarily want to leave just because somebody else is telling them that they need to. So this is some of the work installed at the back-to-backs, and it does sit well. It's a really, really appropriate venue. I think that it was invaluable in forming this partnership from our perspective, because it allows a context, more of a context for the work, so people can see that there's a continuation from the back-to-backs housing to today. And, you know, we were able to have that bigger platform to talk about the work. I also think there's a tendency of visitors to the back-to-backs to think that the issues about social housing are in the past, because it stops in 1930. They have their three houses that go from 1840 to 1890 and 1930. And with the tours that I've been on, because it's a linear progression of things improving, you know, there's like running water and there's electricity eventually, but it's presented in such a linear fashion that things can only improve. And I think our value lies in we're live. We're current. This is what's happening in another area of the city, and our being there allows that story to carry on and continue. So it's very mutually beneficial. And we've got a program of events. So what Lisa was saying about the ghetto bus, we're doing a to-in and fro-in. So people will come from the back-to-backs to Druids Heath to visit homes there in a similar fashion and to hear the stories behind each of the homes as well. So yeah, it's a very collaborative, mutually beneficial project.
Thank you, Jane. Now let's go ahead with Hillary, please.
Okay. Okay, you can hear me, yes? Okay, great. Hello. Thank you for having me, Andrea and Glenn, and it's really great to hear the presentations already by Lisa and Jane. I'm going to try to go fast. I have a lot of images, but I wanted to talk about, oops, I won't go that fast. This is my office. I'm an architect. I'm also a professor at Columbia University. I hold the inaugural IDC professorship in housing design, and I helped found the housing lab here at Columbia. So I'm deeply interested in housing, and as an architect, I have been working on a variety of things. A lot of the work intersects with museums and housing. And so I wanted to show some of that work and a couple of projects, and then some of the actually museums that I have been involved with through teaching, taking my students, but just how much I use the museums and have them as part of the pedagogy. So my practice also involves making books. We're very interested in representation in architecture, and I really like Glenn talking about life of the city. We have done a very large book around scale figures and representation, how we as architects draw, we build, but mostly we draw, and we also draw people. So what are the kinds of figures and how do we represent life through drawing? This also became then an installation called the Selfie Curtain, which has recently been exhibited here in the US at the Mack Center in Los Angeles. We also work on school projects. This is a folk art school. So students are going on to make art. We work with art historians. This is for a historian who writes a lot about certain artists and catalog raisonnés. We also work with museums to build housing. This is an off-the-grid solar chimney overnight guest pavilion for an artist in New Mexico. That's with the Museum of Outdoor Arts. And also here working with an artist who now is making work around housing. So our work is constantly, I feel like, in this realm of our webinar here. We ourselves have participated in several competitions. This is at MoMA, the Foreclosed Housing Show, where we made speculative housing all on workers' housing. We concentrate a lot on workers' housing. This was for the Venice Biennial, looking at a site in Detroit. All of this work also is very collaborative, or if it isn't, we turn it into that, where we make books and we invite others to write articles about architecture, not about our work in particular, but about architecture. We've also been able to win competitions around affordable housing and have built work around that. This is a project sponsored by MLA Pulitzer as a group project in St. Louis, which is more middle income housing. And this is another 100% affordable housing with supportive housing in Washington, DC. It's 65 units of that. The project Andrea really asked me to present on is the Laboratorio de Vivienda, which is also a collaborative project where we were invited to curate a group of 32 international architects designing prototypes for housing. They're units, so these are not single family houses, but units meant to be aggregated in a community. And so this is built as a kind of demonstration space to learn about how to make housing and with different materials than might typically be found. We're very interested in unconventional. Our practice is very unconventional, and we sort of seek others in that realm and have a kind of wonderful cohort of architects that we have been working with over the years. Again, this is another book that we made as part of it. We interviewed all the architects and asked them to also write and contribute a text, just trying to always look for ways to have a kind of broader audience and deeper discussion around housing. We designed the education building in the background, which was to store all of the models and drawings and really be a kind of education visitor center. Because of the political situation in Mexico, the government that was in power when we designed this and had this project built is no longer there and replaced. So now it has become actually a shelter for women and young children. So we're very proud of this work, even though maybe it didn't intend to be what it is. Our books are very large scale. We also are interested in that. The work I do with my students involves also very much understanding the development of the history of New York. I'm deeply interested in New York City, which is where I'm zooming in from. And one of the institutions we've been working with is the Henry Street Settlement. Lillian Wald, who is a nurse, activist, co-founder of the NAACP, established so many things, including the first playground in New York City, but also I think it's in the United States. I'm still researching all of this. This is a view from her bedroom where she took over the backyard. And Cor Viale is a project I researched while I was at the American Academy in Rome, and was able to meet with faculty from Roma Tre, who founded the Laboratorio di Città Cor Viale, and they've also created a museum called Museo del Memori, which is a project I think that's been around for maybe about 20 years, starting with Stalker in 2004. This is a little catalog. I thought you'd like to see that. But they have taken a unit and converted it into their museum space, and they have collected and documented residences' homes that they built. They're informally settled and part of the building, and now they're giving them a kind of legitimate homes, even though their homes were quite beautiful in many cases. It's not what you think when you think of squatting, which I think all of us here know squatting in a better term than what is often portrayed. And so this also, they've created this Archivo Cor Viale, and have collected many documents and publications. And so within housing, there is a museum, and I'm very interested in this relationship of when housing is documenting not only itself, but also residents and events. It was very nice. They accepted some of my photographs into their museum. Sugar Hill here in New York City, I have taken the students many times to visit. It has a school and also a children's museum for storytelling. So residents live above. They also are able to work in the building and have relationships with the museum. This is Ellen Baxter and students, and Ellen and Charlene Melville, who is a director of the Children's Museum. So these are, as I'm thinking and working on housing projects, I'm always thinking about these things together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary, for all the different projects that you presented. I'm sure we will be able to deepen the discussions around some of these projects during the questions. And now, please, Robin, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And I am so grateful to be part of this amazing group of people. And learned so much already from so many people. So what I'd like to talk about very briefly in my time is about how my team at the University of Miami has worked to chronicle the history of affordable housing in Miami through archival collecting, oral histories, and digital platforms so that these histories can reach a wider audience. I'm an urban and environmental historian. And I'm also the founding director of our Office of Civic and Community Engagement, which is really designed to bring academic resources to address community identified needs in partnership with community organizations. So Miami is experiencing an affordable housing crisis, like many cities across the United States, but we are actually the epicenter of that crisis. In 2022, Miami became the least affordable city in the United States. And that's not because our cost of housing is more expensive than New York or San Francisco. It's the affordability gap right? That our wages are so much lower than the cost of living and the cost of housing. But this, in fact, isn't new. Miami has had an affordable housing crisis for quite some time. In fact, coming out of the recession in 2008, 2009, Florida was the epicenter of the foreclosure crisis. So Florida had more mortgages than any other state in the country that were either delinquent or in foreclosure. And so at that time was when we formed the Office of Civic and Community Engagement and basically made the determination that the best strategy for us was really to think about how it is that we could address the affordable housing crisis through the university, through the resources that we have. So we started working with grassroots organizations who were trying to think about affordability and really place residents back in their homes. So we began working with our library to do archival collecting from grassroots activist organizations. This is one of them called Take Back the Land, which was really looking to think about how to take properties that had been foreclosed on and residents that had been made homeless and match them together, often in ways that technically were not legal, but nonetheless provided a space for people to be housed. In addition, there was also a public housing project called the Scott Carver Project that was raised as a result of a Hope 6 project that was designed basically to do rehabilitation. There was one building left standing after Scott Carver was raised. You see it here. And in fact, residents from Scott Carver created what was called a name wall, where they could keep track of all of the residents who had been displaced, because the public housing department was not, in fact, doing that in an effective way. And so we started a project with the former Scott Carver residents to collect their materials, to do oral histories. We hosted a community reunion with them at a public park in the Miami neighborhood where the housing project existed in Liberty City. Basically asking people to bring to this community reunion any ephemeral material that they had, photographs, petitions, letters, and that also became part of our special collections project. We then brought those residents to our archive at the University of Miami Libraries so they could learn what the process looked like to do archival preservation, and also how these materials could be accessible to a wide audience. And so now we've been working for over a decade with our Special Collections Division at the library, and they have curated an oral history collection on the history of housing activism, and also a larger kind of research guide for grassroots activist history. Much of the work that we do is really framed in terms of the history of racialized planning and zoning and displacement. So like many cities across the United States, urban planning involved the displacement of communities of color. So this is a historic African-American neighborhood called Overtown. It was a segregated red lines neighborhood. Most of the railroad workers who built the railroad that enabled Miami to actually grow as a city lived adjacent to the railroad tracks in this neighborhood of Overtown. So there were a series of processes of racialized displacement that happened when the downtown business district expanded, but also later in the 1960s with highway construction and I-95. So you could see there were over 15,000 households that were destroyed. Local businesses were demolished as a result of this highway cutting directly through the commercial heart of Overtown. And so I've worked with students to use kind of innovative technologies like ArcGIS to chronicle the history of racialized displacement and its relationship to housing. In South Florida, we created an ArcGIS story map to chronicle this story that incorporates some of the oral histories that we've collected. And then my team has also developed what's called the Miami Housing Solutions Lab. So this is a suite of online tools designed to basically chronicle the history of housing in South Florida, but also provide data and policy solutions around affordable housing and also urban resilience. So one component of this Housing Solutions Lab is a housing policy timeline, similar to what Jane talked about, but this is in digital format. So we have historic photographs, historical documents, and a timeline that shows the history of affordable housing at the national, state, and local levels from the 1930s to the present. There are also themes within this timeline, so changing neighborhoods, race and property, and financing affordable housing. And then my team also created what's called the MAP, Miami Affordability Project. So this is a mapping tool that's fully interactive, free, and publicly accessible. That has over 350 different data filters around the intersections of housing affordability and climate change. Because of course we're in South Florida, much of our property is below sea level. So climate change, sea level rise, storm surge, flooding, extreme heat, these are all considerations we need to think about when we're talking about housing affordability and access. The map that you see is showing census tracts that are in yellow, where 75 to 100% of households in those census tracts are cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing. And the magenta and purple dots are public and assisted housing. So we think that through data visualization, you can also tell a really effective story, right? Like just by looking at this map, you see there's a concentration of affordable housing in the urban core, but a great deal of need as you move further west and further north. And, you know, we also can see the ways in which climate is going to continue to impact our affordable housing stock. So this is a map that shows sea level rise and storm inundation in 2080. So you can see the areas that are in darker blue are areas that are in essence going to be underwater, but the areas in lighter blue are going to be inundated with flooding, right? So again, it forces us to think about how climate change is currently impacting us, but also planning for the future. Elevation is also a really key component. And it just so happens that those areas at the highest elevation, geologically, there is a coastal ridge that is just inland from the coast. Those are the areas where communities of color over the last century have been displaced to. So now those properties are actually more valuable, right? As coastal inundation continues to happen, it becomes more expensive to build along the coast. Insurance rates are much higher. And so now there's a great deal of speculation in those neighborhoods along the coastal ridge. So our current work is focused on climate gentrification, right? That process by which neighborhoods that historically were considered less valuable are now more valuable because of their resilience to climate risk. So we've been doing an oral history project with grassroots community organizations and residents in these neighborhoods to understand what they're experiencing now, how they think about their neighborhood, how they think about cultural heritage within their communities as the threat of displacement becomes real. So I want to go back to that first image that I started with, which was Scott Carver, the public housing project that was raised. So there was a last building standing, like at the Jane Addams homes at Scott Carver. And actually, because of grassroots activism and political pressure, that building remains standing. It was redeveloped into 4 new units of affordable housing. And so in many ways, it becomes like a museum to the history of public housing and displacement in Miami. And they also preserved the mural, right? That was part of that kind of resident displacement project. So again, just thinking about how the community itself and the physical structures within the community become a testament to that community's resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin, for this very interesting and also based on so many topics that we're going to discuss. So it's a very rich presentation. I would like to remember all the participants of the roundtable that if you're interested in the books by Hilary and Robin, we did share the very short bibliography on our website. So if you do click on the first page, the news page of CAMOC, you do have a special note on the roundtable, and there you can find a link to a very short bibliography where you can find some books by Hilary and also the latest book by Robin if you want to read a bit more about the subject. Thank you again, Robin. And now let's go to our later presenters, the last ones. So Elena and Paulo, I give the floor to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Andrea. I think, Paolo, you can now, yes, share the screen. Thanks. I'll just make a short introduction from the point of view of the general museological strategy that MUBA, the Barcelona History Museum, has followed with the Bon Pastor project. And then Paolo will go into details as a specialist in the subject and co-curator of the project. For those who don't know it, MUBA is a city museum which explains the historical trajectory of Barcelona throughout its territory, throughout the city, distributing the museum's rooms into 19 different heritage spaces. In this way, the museum offers an image of the city in all its breadth, geographically through all the city, temporarily covering the different periods of the life of the city, and also thematically with a diversity of uses that the museum considers relevant to explain and understand urban life as the world of work, city supply, or in the case at hand today, the issue of housing. So last year, MUBA opened the Bon Pastor site. It's a block of the worker houses built in 1929 as social housing that has been preserved and restored to integrate the important narrative of urban majorities into the museum narrative and preserve its memory and that of the neighborhood. And this is especially relevant to explain in a city museum who talks about the city, but also maybe more important, who talks about citizens. Very, very briefly, the museological strategy in this project focus on working at different levels in a multi-scale approach and under the paradigm of the urban history. And that way, it allow working from the proximity, from the neighborhood, working with the neighbors, with the entities, with the associations, with a high degree of participation. Actually, they are currently part of the management of the space through the creation of a study center that actively participates in the museum practices. But it also allows to make an urban reading of the city as a whole and treat workers' housing as a relevant historical category, and even more, working on the ability to extrapolate and compare our history with the history of popular housing in other cities, explaining a more global phenomenon. And that's why the project goes from the specific mosaicization of 4 houses in 4 different periods to a more general exhibition on housing with a more global and comparative context with other cities. So I'll pass the floor to Paolo to talk specifically about the curatorial project.
Thank you very much, Elena. Thank you very much, Andrea, and all with our participation to this roundtable. Well, actually, have been the curator of one of the different sections of the Bon Pastor site. I'm also an architect and a professor of History of Design and Architecture at the Pisava School of Design. What we should say is also that the MUBA Bon Pastor is a project which is included in a more comprehensive discourse about the history of majorities in the city of Barcelona, which comprises other different sites which are collected under this idea of an axis along the river Besòs, where we are talking also from the museum about supply, industrialization, and of course, housing. Well, when we were approaching the idea of creating a museum in this first urban public settlement actually in Barcelona, we were thinking about also the singularity and representatives of this study case. Bon Pastor is a context actually where different housing solutions have been tested over time. Along almost 1 century. So each of them was fed by different conception of urban planning, housing policies, architecture. So it's a very interesting context. And it has also a special condition of being one of the few housing areas managed always by the municipality in a city that lacks large available areas for dwelling. So it explains why so many projects and proposals were presented a long time, although only the last one that was developed after a competition in 2002 was implemented for the whole reconstruction of the neighborhood. Well, when we are approaching this study case from an urban planning and context perspective, we actually have to deal with complexity and need to read phenomena of urban history, of town planning and housing from a multiplicity of complementary points of view. For instance, some of them, the political, economic, and social context, both at general level and a local level, the specific policies and decisions that the public bodies like councils, the state, and other institutions also ignited. Positioning and knowledge of the technicians who carried out the different projects and planning operations. The different bodies that regulate and manage the processes, like in this case, the Municipal Housing Board, a long time. The people who arrived to the neighborhood and to these homes with their own cultures, their own expectations, their ways of organizing their personal lives, their family relationships, etc. The organizations that articulated the collective life at a neighborhood level, so unions, parties, neighborhood associations, religious institutions, public bodies, interest groups, etc. And then it was a mostly working class neighborhood. So the cultures of work, formal work, informal work, different people and groups expresses different interests. And at the end, also the cultures of living. So aspects that have a very important influence on those living cultures, technologies, economic resources, trends, etc. So we tried to match all these different layers in the discourse. The neighbors very quickly started in 1929, 1928 with the International Exhibition of Barcelona. The 4 public housing neighborhoods were designed and built in Barcelona with a very rigid and strict grid, which is based on the industrial colony towns in the cities and in the area of Catalonia, very small houses actually, with a certain point where entering in conflict with other ideas from the modern movement on how to promote residential neighborhoods for the working class, like in this case Casa Bloc, which is another interesting example in Barcelona. Actually, Casa Bloc was a very different model, not based on small scale housing, but on a large scale and blocks building that also was a site there that were transformed into one museum site, preserving and restoring one of the different apartments that are contained in this context. Here, the operation, I mentioned this operation because the focus is quite different from the focus that we had at MUBA. In this case, the point was trying to reconstruct something that never existed, actually, because these interiors never were as we can see them now. And this reconstruction is an ideal reconstruction of the modern architects group that designed this site. So there was a very careful, actually, reconstruction of different elements of the architecture, but the furniture actually never was, as you can see in these images. It's interesting because it's an effort, an homage, to pay an homage to this important architects group. Our neighborhood, well, was evolving, the densification and the need of new housing in the city during the post-war era, with the economic growth of the 1950s and 1960s, especially, which brought very different architectural and urban typologies to the context, like those we can see here. So there is always a conflict between different urban models, between different ways of interpreting how this neighborhood could also be transformed into something different. And there is a constant discussion about how to refurbish or modify or transform the neighborhood. So this is the context. MUBA came in this project actually when it was decided to preserve one of, two of those small-scale housing blocks, and so somehow a discourse about how to conserve and what to tell, what to explain in this place was also important to define. Different action took place in 2017. Actually, the competition was held in order to propose a specific design proposal for the refurbishment and the conservation of one of those two blocks that was decided to preserve from the destruction, and also a very extending campaign of data collection from the neighbors, from different sources, visual memories, oral histories, etc. were collected, furniture as well. A lot of objects were collected when the neighbors were leaving their houses in order to move to the new houses that were built in different phases. And so there was a very extended campaign of data collection, object collection, classification, restoration process of furniture, conservation, etc., extensive archival research, and even a cycle of international study workshops that completed somehow the discourse that we built around this context. So the other side, and this is the last part of my presentation, is about the reconstruction of the 4 houses that at the end we decided to reconstruct in order to explain this long lasting history of living context in this area. Well, the period 1929-2010, which is the period that the museum exposes, presents very significant changes in society, life and cultural practices, both in general in Barcelona and specifically in the Bon Pastor area. The interior is linked also to specific circumstances, like each family history, which reflects common trends in each era, in each period. The objects and documents that we collected are abundant, especially as we approach the more recent times. So we had a lot of different materials and inputs. The project actually is based on this sound research process, and we tried also to move away from an ethnographic perspective in order to privilege an historical narrative that involved also explaining the multiple aspects, the multiple layers of this reality, placing objects and elements that belong to a specific family in a space of a restored dwelling, which should also explain and being representative of a certain historical moment. So it's not only a specific story of a family, but something that represents a collective way of living or trends which were significant in each moment. So what we try to show, well, the migratory roots of urban growth in Barcelona, and especially in those neighborhoods, the different actors that came into play at different moments, the fact of studying and understanding home and its interior as a means of affirming individual, family, but also community and citizen identity. This is also the complexity somehow of the narrative that we try to build, expressing desire for social promotion. Also, the interior decoration actually shows constantly this idea of a social promotion and improvement of economic conditions. Showing the multiplicity, also the solution adopted, because actually every interior was different from the other, communicating the tensions between the unique and the general. So the object that have to tell this history, which is an individual history, but also a shared history. Finding a formula to turn the heritage site into a significant element, telling a story which represents this neighborhood, but also represents the whole story of public housing in Barcelona. Encouraging the participation and also converting this site into a research space. Actually, Now there is a research center which promotes other research, exhibitions, etc., in order to creating a contest which is not a static site, but a center that aspires to be a living cultural space and also an educational environment, in order also to let the young generation know about history of housing in Barcelona. At the end, what we got are two rooms, MUBA room number 34, which is explaining the housing history in the city of Barcelona under the title Housing the Urban Majority. So it explains all the different periods and evolutions and trends in different periods. And then room number 35, which is Life in Bon Pastor, which is explaining those 4 different moments that we identified like important moments with a certain interior coherence in the discourse we built. So the first one, which is covering the first part until the early 1950, the second one, which is dealing with the development of the late 50s and 60s, more or less the last part of the Francoist dictatorship. The third house, which is the reform, because at a certain moment the municipal administration started a reform process in the houses, and like the last moment in which the population was aware that the neighborhood was substituted by new houses, and so they were waiting for what was happening that they didn't know. What is interesting also is that inside the houses, we not only reconstructed the interiors based on, of course, all this research that we did, but also we left one of the rooms for a museology narrative, where we explain other things that allow to better understand the living conditions, the personal family memories, etc., that bring again the voice of the inhabitants into these houses that now are a museum. So we think that this is also something which is very important. Let perceive somehow the presence of these people inside these houses. The last part was the organization of a very extended website where most of this information and more information is also available online. I think that this was the last one. I would like also to mention all the rest of the research team that was part of this really exciting project. And thank you very much for your attention and time.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you, Elena. We are very short on time. It's always difficult when we have such interesting presentations. And we decided to have a lot of panelists today, but the idea was to give an overview of different projects, not only in Europe, but also in the United States. And that's why we are running short of time, but I would like to condense the questions I had prepared in 2 main questions that we can try to at least start discussing it maybe in 5 minutes, 5-10 minutes max. But it would be basically how all of you as as researchers and museum professionals working directly with communities in the different neighborhoods where you had the chance to act. How was it for you to deal with the power struggles between, for example, the local government and the state, how we say, the state managers, or also getting the confidence, getting the trust from the communities to share their histories with you. How do you manage that? Because I think that's something that it's very delicate sometimes as museum professionals and researchers to gain the trust of the communities to start working with them. And secondly, to manage and to navigate all these different power tensions and struggles that are present in any neighborhood, in any city around the world. So it's an open question, it's quite vast, but if you could each just point out, how did you navigate situations like that, please?
I can just quickly start and say that we always say at our museum that it's not just a museum, but it's a movement. And we borrow sort of the notions of great organizers like Ella Baker and other people have always said that the people with the so-called problems are the people with the solutions, right? So it's really about being in solidarity with people and not just in service. And so in some ways we have to defy the expectations of what a museum we've been taught is supposed to do. So for example, at the National Public Housing Museum, we also have 15 units of housing in the back of the museum because that's what the community actually said that they needed and wanted. We also have a community benefits agreement, which is normally sort of reserved in the United States for big corporations like Walmart or other sort of organizations. But, you know, as a nonprofit, we actually get tax deductions, you know, for our land, and we're a nonprofit. So we should actually be for the community. And our community benefits agreement, you know, dictates also not just sort of our landscaping contracts and who provides food for our events, which are all Section 3 public housing residents, but also we have a cultural workforce training program so that every public housing resident can move from visitor service staff to curatorial to management or anything like that. And so I think it's really important to create official structures within the museum, not just like a collections policy, which is very important. It has all the ways of dictating our objects and our artifacts, but also creating official policies about how we work with community, and so that we can be inside the community and try to blur those boundaries of the so-called us and so-called them.
Thank you, Lisa. Anyone else would like to join in?
I can dip in. As a small organisation, and working with residents who are in very vulnerable positions, I think one of the first things that we noticed was a massive fear of retribution. So we had to be sensitive around that, and we had to anonymize a lot of the work, really. And it wasn't, a lot of people would not participate because they felt their future would be jeopardized by speaking out. And that is the culture in Birmingham, unfortunately. And as a very small organization as well, we are not we're a thorn in the side, basically. We're not, our position and our work isn't valued within our local authority, apart from the arts department, who were really supportive. So I think for us, and for being able to support those people who are in that vulnerable position, forming relationships with other institutions, which might be, Birmingham City Council is very, very, very big, but the National Trust is also very large and is national. So, and commands a degree of respect, I would say. So for us and for those people, then it means, we are validated in some way because we're there, and we have their support, and it's recognised that this is an ongoing part of a story of struggle through that. But it's certainly very difficult, and it's dismissed. What we do is dismissed because we're going up against, vested interests. So yeah, that's our experience.
If I can add something, in our case, I think that the secret was trying to listen to everybody, to try to understand their point of view, but at the end of the day, trying to keep also our independence like historians. I think that this is very important because, of course, when you are telling a story or trying to interpret the past, there are many ways of doing that. but I think that you should be also able to justify your own decisions, your own curatorial decisions on a sound base, which is research, which is the document base that you have. And so this allows maybe you to keep a more impartial position.
And just one thing more, I think it's in the issue of getting the confidence of the neighborhood, it was also very important to create the awareness of the importance of the project among them. Because when, in our case, when we arrive at the neighborhood, we had the general impression that they feel that it was not important, that making a museum there, why? And when you are there for a lot of months working, talking with them, following their steps, because in that moment some of them were moving from a flat or from the house to a flat, following them, talking with them, sharing moments, but talking and explaining about the topic and about the history. When they feel that they were part of the history of the city and that project was important, they feel more confident, and it helped a lot to make all the project.
I could just say one thing. I have been trying to change the way I speak about projects and recognize that a housing project is something that's being drawn, but once it's built, we maybe should think of a different word and not call it a project, because it's a real thing. People are living there. And the term, at least in the United States, project is a very negative connotation in the kind of public. And the other thought is around changing another word, like not calling housing units or apartments products. And so this is something I'm always talking with my students about as well. Like, let's change the way we speak about what it is we're working on.
I'll just add one small thing, which refers back to something that Lisa said at the start, you know, a quote from Rebecca Solnit around somebody owning their story, and it's always their story. And so when we did our oral histories, we have a standard oral history consent form that our library would use. And some of the people we interviewed actually wanted more autonomy and control over what happened with their story. And so in working collaboratively with these community groups, we rewrote our entire library's oral history agreement that was really much more mindful about the authority that people have over their story, how it can be used, where it can be used. So again, just this one project forced a kind of reconsideration about oral history policy more generally.
Thank you all. The second question and the last one, because we really don't have time and I don't want to keep everyone until later, is just about climate change, because it is a topic that is very much discussed in different spheres of our societies worldwide, and in ICOM as well. Different committees are discussing how climate change can affect museums and collections, and vice versa, how museums and collections and exhibitions can help communities to get more awareness around climate change issues. And in the question of housing and affordable housing, we do have not only climate change, but we do have the gentrification system, let's say, that it's also creating attention in different cities around the world. So I think, Robin, you can maybe start quickly with Miami, because Miami is a very specific case, and I think it's very interesting to understand. But all different cities, let's say, that are represented here today, be it Barcelona, New York with Hillary, Chicago with Lisa, and Birmingham with Jane, we all have climate change and gentrification affecting affordability of housing at the moment. So Robin, please, if you could start.
Sure. So, you know, Miami is experiencing climate change on the ground every day right now. Most of Miami is at sea level. If you're at 14 feet above sea level, that's considered high elevation, right? So we know that there's tremendous risk. And there's tremendous risk to coastal communities, but also inland flooding. So the topography of the city is such that we also get water kind of rising through our limestone foundation of the city. And also Miami and, much of Florida were founded over a century ago by massive projects to drain the Everglades. Right, so we're also in a process of trying to restore the natural ecosystem of the Everglades, because of course the Everglades, as well as mangroves along the coast, coral reefs along the coast, all of these provided natural protection against storm surge and flooding, and so we've lost all of that. So it's a really delicate balance when you're trying to build for affordability, equity, and climate resilience. And so one of the key areas that we're working on at the University of Miami with grassroots organizations, as well as developers and architects and designers, municipal policymakers, is how can you develop urban resilience grounded in equity, right? And that means that when you do infrastructure investment, for example, in greening neighborhoods and providing more tree canopy, more cool roofs to mitigate extreme heat, or you're trying to build higher to mitigate against flooding, that you need to be mindful of the impact that that has on real estate values and the communities where you're trying to help, right? Those most vulnerable communities that are at the kind of forefront of experiencing climate threats. So community benefits agreements, right? Thinking about equity in development, that has to be the centerpiece if we're going to achieve any kind of adaptation mitigation strategy for urban resilience.
Yeah, can I also just chime in and say that, we can't understand climate change and its impacts without looking at the history of public housing, especially in the United States. I mean, thinking about disaster capitalism, the organized abandonment of certain communities, the impacts of Katrina. But as a public historian, I also just want to say that it's really about environmental justice issues. And if we go back in time and look at the history of public housing and sort of lead paint, the ways that people have organized to fight for environmental justice in their communities, there's also so much to learn from how we can build, how we empower people to actually, sort of inform this climate crisis that we're facing now. And so, yeah, it's all there in the history of public housing, as long as we care to actually look and listen.
Well, in the case of the Bon Pastor Museum, we decided, as it was an historical point of view, that we actually weren't going to the present. But it is interesting what happened after the destruction of the original neighborhood, because a new actually housing system and different blocks were built. So the first one were built around 2007, 2010, before the approval of the new technical regulation in Barcelona. And the last one, the blocks that are being completed now, or have been completed recently, propose a very different approach to the sustainability problem and techniques that also reduce the impact of, for example, energy consumption, water consumption, the collection of water in public spaces, etc. So in this city, there is a sensibility about these problems. And also the municipal administration actually has some real concrete instruments in order to propose a different approach to use of public space to improve the quality of public housing. I think that the problem also, like an architect, I can say that is what we inherited from the past, which has a very low quality, is very difficult to improve in terms of, for example, insulation, better way of living conditions, etc., reducing of the energetic impact. So I think that it's very important actually that people is sensible to these topics, and also try to understand that we need to think in a different way to what a city is, not only like a place where people live and inhabit, but also on how we use and understand public space. We can't, of course, understand public space like this space where car moves, and this is mostly its function. We should understand that there are other important elements in this public space, like, for example, the trees, the way we use the soil, etc., pavings, urban elements, which are fundamental in order to try to mitigate the impact and the effect of climate change. So I think that this is the real next challenge, that everybody is conscious that this is something important and affects directly the quality of life in cities especially.
Hilary, would you like to say something? Or?
Yeah, maybe I would just say a little bit about, the public housing here in New York with NYCHA is so far in debt that they can't make repairs on buildings. And, this really radically affects seniors and people who are aging. If elevators are broken in a heat wave, it's very difficult for them to leave. And so to think about the public realm, I agree a lot with what Paolo was just talking about, and that the public space, it's not just housing, but it's the spaces in support of housing in neighborhoods. And I did a study called Vacant Spaces, where we looked at commercial spaces and made proposals for how they could be reimagined, because often landlords or building owners are leaving these spaces vacant, taking tax deductions, et cetera. One other thing that was interesting, I've recently been researching also with students, but is the history of community gardens. And these were founded in response to places like on Lower East Side where tenements were being abandoned. And so residents, artists who were squatting were trying to improve their neighborhood. And now these residences in these neighborhoods have wonderful gardens and they're desirable properties. And so now people are moving, and the residents that had been living maybe can't now afford to live there, and they've done all this work over decades to make a great place to live. So this all affects, I think this is all really challenged too by sustainability and climate change, without a doubt.
Thank you, Hilary. Jane, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I suppose like in Druids Heath, so it was built in the 60s, so it's a system built, and it's not very well built. So while we have like a retrofit movement in the city, it's not, we don't know how appropriate that is to the tower blocks, and also because the council are hell-bent on a demolition. So there's a dialogue between those two things, really. The people who live in the blocks and who are on very low incomes and have the highest bills because they're so badly built, and they have leaks and everything like that. So there's a retrofit thing, but also because we are very Druids Heath focused, it's got a trig point, so it's actually a very, very high point, and the nearest point east, according to local folklore, is the Ural Mountains, and this means that when the easterly wind blows, it's colder. And back in the 1980s, they did a survey and they got more money because of this. They compared the temperatures inside and outside the flats and got supplementary benefit to help with that. So this is part of the local folklore. And what we're trying to do as an art project is to build on that and to introduce some kind of wind power, community power. And we're hoping to possibly collaborate with another organisation called Power Station, who are doing it one street at a time. So, those are the efforts we're making. That's the situation in Druids Heath.
Thank you all. I would love to continue the discussion, but we did pass a lot our time. I would like to just thank you all again for joining us today. If everything goes well, so soon you'll have the full recorded discussion online, and maybe we can continue in the future the discussion with a bit more time, but at least now we had an overview of the different projects, museums, and also how even if we're in different cities across the Atlantic, we're all facing pretty much the same discussions and the same problems as well. So thank you all again. Glenn, would you like to do a closing talk about Amsterdam?
Okay, well, thank you, Andrea, so much. And thank you all to all of our presenters here for these really fascinating perspectives. As you see so many threads of connection, like you said, between these different projects and really creative ways that museums are, and both museums and our partners are engaging, sort of bringing to light community concerns and community responses as well as community voices. So I think this is the wonderful thing that we can do as a network, connecting cities and city museums. So special thanks to all of you who participated. A super thanks to Andrea for both editing the CAMOC review that inspired this and bringing everybody together today. It was, you know, just such a wonderful, brilliant program. So if anybody wants to keep in touch with the CAMOC, we've got a mailing list. Again, our conference is coming up in Amsterdam on the 9th through 11th of October. We will send out an email when this program is up on our YouTube page. So we look forward to that being public, and you can share it out with all kinds of folks as well. So I hope you'll stay tuned and give us ideas if you want to see future programs like this. What are the topics that you're interested in? We would love to respond and share. So
thanks, Glenn. You rock.
So you guys rock, and thanks, you know, on behalf of both my Greensboro History Museum and Icon CAMOC, thanks everybody for being around. We'll see you again soon.